Hey guys, this is the second episode of System Design 100, and today we'll be talking about databases. So the earlier example that we talked about, right, if you remember in my last episode, you can go back to episode 1, we were talking about a very static web application, right? Doesn't have any kind of a functionality or any kind of data input output. It's not dealing with that. It was just a static web application containing some information in a form of HTML, not HTML, just some data in form of images, vectors, and videos, like very static data. It was not performing any kind of operation or not dealing with data input or output. Okay, so in that case, we were not in need of any external database because our web server was handling that fine. But now if we want our application to perform data input output operations, for example, I want to input some data, a very huge amount of data, not very small data, simple front end web server also can handle. But when we're talking about data input output operations in a very large quantity, like in very frequent and in very large quantity, we need to have a database for our application, so that our web server or front end server can is relieved from the load of handling a large amount of data. That is why we add a database to our application. So just create it. So generally we write or update in our database, and we generally read from the database. Okay, yeah. So this is how we generally denote a database whenever we're talking about designing, right? It's just a notation, just a diagram used for it. Internally, if I talk about, right, you might see everywhere wherever you talk about database design like this. This is nothing but a server itself, in a very similar server like we have for a web server. These two things are very similar. It's just we denote it like this way so that we can understand it's a database. Internally, it's this itself. The difference between this web server and this web server is in modern terms is that this is optimized to handle web requests specifically, and this is optimized to handle database request input output, and specifically handling database applications inside of it. That is why. Now, one other request is that one other question you might also be getting if you are familiar to servers, right? That servers are just computers and they also have a storage inside of them. They have CPU. So why just we don't install this database application inside of this server itself instead of this, right? So like I said again, I said, right, when we start talking about our application dealing with data, we talk about a large amount of data and a lot of input output requests. And I said every server is specialized for itself. So whatever server we normalized server we'll be using for our front end, it is specialized for handling web requests only, and it's not specialized to handle data input output operations. It's not storage optimized, and it's not built in that way so that it can take a lot of request and a lot of update and insert and read request, right? That is why we create a separate web server just for database. Okay, now talking about database, we all know, right, there are two kind of databases currently in the market. Just let me check if it is coming in the frame. Right, yes. Not sure if it is visible, right? So there are two kind of databases in the market right now. We have SQL or relational databases, or we have NoSQL. And NoSQL database can be multiple types, right? They can be document databases, column databases, graph, and a lot of types are there. So there are multiple types of NoSQL databases. Relational databases, they're developed in early 80s. I guess I do not exactly remember the time, but yeah, they exist from very long ago, and they're very reliable. They're very you can say very widely used kind of databases. And if you are trying to design a mobile application for very basic input output of data, not consisting of unstructured data and very huge amount of data, these things can handle almost everything. So this, if you know, right, this consists of tables, and you have queries. You can join the tables. You have joins, and joins and queries to, you know, put the data and fetch the data. There are ways you can normalize and denormalize tables depending upon what level of data, what kind of data you're using, and how big is your table. So these are these are the features of SQL database. Okay. So example of this database can be, you know, MySQL. You might have heard of it. Postgres, etc., etc. You might have heard a lot of options also. There is Microsoft SQL Server also. Now, NoSQL database is mainly used, and you know, in modern times, the shift is happening from SQL to NoSQL. Not everywhere, but in most parts, because whenever we're dealing with very high volume of data, kind of streaming data, or we have a lot of users, like in billions and millions. So you know, SQL starts lagging behind because it's not very flexible in terms of, you know, handling large amount of data. So in that case, we go for NoSQL database, and these come in a form of yeah, like I said, right, document database, column database. These can handle very large data, and these can handle unstructured data also. So the difference between unstructured data is that, for example, you are storing a user information across the world. So it's very much possible that some users can have a longer list of data. For example, name, last name, address, college, university, social security number, etc., etc. And some users might not have this much data. They have even less form of data. Only name, last name, yeah, something. Some other user might have some other form of data. So you know, storing all of this in a single table, you'll have a lot of issues, because if you try to create, you know, a schema out of these values, a lot of a lot of columns, a lot of cells will go null for some users, and some other cell will go null for some other user. So it will not be a very, you can say, no, a good form of data in representation. Joining the data will be very difficult, and dealing with data into application will be very difficult. That is why we have NoSQL. It can take any form of data. Generally, NoSQL did, for example, there is a very famous database you might have heard of called MongoDB. It's a document database. It stores the data in form of a JSON. So you don't have to worry about the schema and the structuring of the data. You can just, whatever form the data comes in, if some user contains only 2 lines, it can store it in a form of document, and our application can query. Now, one other feature of NoSQL database is that it is specifically used for, in case you're looking for, lightning fast response from a database. So generally, the servers that are handling NoSQL database, they're designed to be very fast, because it is designed to cater to a very large amount of data. That it is designed to cater for a audience that has a lot of memory. Like me, for example, very huge applications. So these two kind of database that we have, and generally with these two kind of database we use into our application depending upon what our need is.